This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist at KPFT HD2 channel in Houston, Texas. Today we're gonna talk with Greenpeace. Welcome to Mini Geology to Greenpeace. Exactly 1 year ago, New Zealand banned the new oil and gas permits. In other words, we may say that New Zealand banned oil and gas exploration. And by the way, because we're going to talk with people in New Zealand, we don't forget the massacre of the two Christchurch mosques occurred a month ago. A dark day for people who love of all humankind living together on this planet in all our wonderful diversity. We here at KPFT, we were bombed by the Ku Klux Klan in 1970 because we were diverse, and so it has been imprinted in our DNA, the tolerance and openness for diversity. So we won't forget that. Today, as I said, Mini Geology, this radio program talking about geology and connecting geology with the society at large. Mini Geology is connected with Russel Norman from New Zealand. He's the executive director of Greenpeace over there in the other hemisphere in New Zealand. Greenpeace, probably the most visible environmental organization in the world, is with us. Greenpeace has roughly 3 million individual supporters, and his mission is to ensure the ability of the Earth to nurture life in all its diversity. Thank you very much, Russell, to be with us. How's it going over there?
Kia ora, Daniel, and thank you very much for having me on the show and for those very moving and kind words about what happened here a month ago. So greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Thank you, Russell. You being the executive director of Greenpeace in New Zealand and having your finger on the pulse about what's going on in Greenpeace, what is, according to you now, the most important issue challenging the ability of the Earth to nurture life in all its diversity?
Well, I mean, if you think about two of the giant challenges we face, one is climate change, one is biodiversity loss. And they're obviously connected because climate change will lead to even more biodiversity loss, and the loss of biodiversity is making climate change worse as we lose some of the big carbon sinks in our tropical rainforests and in our oceans. So we're, in terms of climate change, I imagine we'll talk about it more, but we're talking about obviously looking at the use of fossil fuels in particular, but also agriculture. And in terms of biodiversity, it's across many fields, but it's obviously we're campaigning to stop the destruction of tropical rainforests, but also looking at oceans and the impact of both pollution in the form of plastic, but also the impact of fishing on the oceans. There's obviously a huge range of other work we're doing, but that's some of the key work we're doing.
Is there anything special about New Zealand in the geographic area that you oversee?
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand is a biodiversity hotspot. Obviously, we sit on the plates where the plates meet, the Pacific and the Austro-Indian plate. And so we have a real enormous range of habitats from very high mountains, and obviously we have growing mountain ranges across New Zealand as the plates hit each other, but also some very deep trenches. So the second deepest trench is in the world is in the New Zealand Exclusive Economic Zone. We have one of the largest EEZs, or Exclusive Economic Zones, in the world in terms of the marine environment. And within that EEZ are a vast array of particularly marine mammals and seabirds, many of which are critically endangered and live within the New Zealand Exclusive Economic Zone. So we have a very particular responsibility in the marine space because of that very large and very diverse EEZ, which goes a long way south as well. So it goes down into the subantarctic islands, as well as having a base in Antarctica, but the EEZ itself actually goes a very long way south, as well as up into the subtropics in the Kermadec. So it's an incredibly biodiverse and important region.
So can you help us understand the link in between this topic that you just developed now about biodiversity in New Zealand and the ban on the new oil and gas permits in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, the primary link is via climate change, but there's some other issues as well. But I mean, the issue obviously is that in order to avoid a catastrophic change in the climate, we can't afford to burn even half of the known fossil fuel reserves. And so we don't want to be looking for more fossil fuel reserves. We've got to leave a whole lot of what we've already found in the ground if we're going to avoid a climate catastrophe. So Greenpeace globally in New Zealand but also elsewhere, we're campaigning to stop the search for more fossil fuels and to restrict the demand side in terms of the use of fossil fuels. And climate change obviously will have a very significant and detrimental impact on biodiversity globally. There's also the kind of, if you like, the regional pollution problems that the risks that come with oil exploration, as we saw with Deepwater Horizon. Oil exploration is the most dangerous phase, and the accidents involved can be truly catastrophic from a biodiversity point of view, as well as, of course, the loss of human life in Deepwater Horizon.
Russel, I'm pretty curious to understand very well and in depth the step-by-step that brought you as a protagonist to arrive to this ban, to reach this goal. Let's start from the idea. When does the idea come up, and how long does it take to develop it?
Well, I mean, at a broad level, I mean, in terms of the climate science, I mean, my father worked on coalfields in Australia, drag lines, and in the giant machines involved in the coal mining industry in Western Queensland, and so he was a mechanical engineer. And so when we were growing up, for us, fossil fuels were a critical part of how we escaped poverty as a family, and how many others did as well. And they were critical to really driving the kind of post-war boom, obviously combined with a much more equal kind of distribution of the wealth that happened through the 60s and 50s than is happening now. But fossil fuels were a critical part of it, and I never questioned them, and neither did my father, really, in terms of climate change. But then, obviously, as the science around climate change became clear, which, for me was through the 80s, then it became apparent that we needed to dramatically reduce our use of fossil fuels and transition away from them as an energy source. And then, obviously, the oil industry pushed back and spread a lot of misinformation and tried to confuse people about the climate science. So it's taken us much longer than it should have in order to take the kind of action we need on climate change because of the specific disinformation and deliberate disinformation from the oil, gas and coal industry. So we've kind of come to the point now where I think finally the science is being pretty widely understood. And so now it's a matter of putting pressure on governments to take the steps needed to respond to that science. And one of those key steps is to stop the search for new fossil fuels and to restrict the use of the existing and known fossil fuel reserves.
You just mentioned the disinformation on climate change. Who do you think is responsible about that? And who are you thinking about more specifically? Which kind of actions or studies that were deviated in order to disinform on purpose?
I mean, if you were to think about the big picture of the political economy, if you like, of energy, but really it's bigger than energy. The capitalism as we know it in the Second World War, after the Second World War, oil companies in particular, but obviously coal industry as well, were absolutely essential to the economies that developed after the Second World War, and it put them in a very powerful position. And aside from their wealth, their political connections are extremely profound. And so when the science of climate science was starting to be developed and well understood, many oil companies, Exxon of course most famously, but many oil companies spent considerable resources, both financial resources as well as political resources, in trying to stop action on that evidence, on that climate science, but also to confuse people about what the science really meant, and funded many groups to promote misinformation. So, this is a well understood reality, and it's completely unsurprising. Obviously, fossil fuel companies are going to be the big losers as a result of the transition to reduced fossil fuel use, so it's entirely expected that they would try to fight all efforts to reduce fossil fuel use, and that's exactly what they've done systematically over the last 30 years or so.
From your point of view, Russell, do you think that this disinformation or misinformation is still going on, or it stopped? It's certainly reduced from some of the many of the fossil fuel companies, because they have started to lose the debate, and now instead of saying their previous line was climate science is bunkum and you can't be sure, and then trying to sow disinformation like the tobacco industry did before, now they're saying more things like, we kind of do accept science around climate change, but we can't do anything too quickly, and so forth and so on. I mean, it's entirely anticipated and completely unsurprising that when you're saying to very large companies, your very business model has to come to an end, which is really what we're saying to fossil fuel companies, that they're going to do everything they can to resist that. And of course, that's what they've done. But the problem is that if you think about our collective intelligence as a species, like human collective intelligence, the science around this is very strong. What we need to do is actually pretty straightforward and clear, but it becomes hard for us to exercise collective intelligence when you have these very large vested interests who are really making that difficult. Russell, more precisely about the idea about banning new oil and gas permits in New Zealand. Do you remember who had that first idea? When exactly did it happen? Where were you, if you were involved into that?
Well, when Greenpeace New Zealand started campaigning on that, I was in Parliament. I was a member of Parliament at that time. And what was interesting about it was how visionary it was, because the campaign started for Greenpeace New Zealand maybe 8 years ago, or 7 or 8 years ago, and because oil companies obviously are so powerful, the very idea that you would say no to oil companies, you're not allowed to look for any more oil, was, I think, an entirely rational response to the science around climate change, but a very kind of controversial proposal to put on the table back then, and still obviously still is, but less so as people have come to understand the kind of the danger that climate change poses to our civilization. It started from Greenpeace, and I was a Green member of Parliament at the time, and I remember thinking that it was a very big ask to put on the table to try to change our political economy in a way that would actually be successful. So I started working at Greenpeace about 4 years ago and joined that campaign, and I was involved in swimming in front of one of the Schlumberger ships, the Amazon Warrior, when it was doing its seismic searching for oil. And we ran it was a very long and difficult campaign to finally get the New Zealand government to agree that they would stop issuing new oil and gas exploration permits, though the existing permits are still being played out.
So, Russell, did you say that the idea was born around 2008?
From Greenpeace New Zealand, yeah, that's when I think Greenpeace New Zealand started campaigning on it. It would have been 7 or 8 years ago.
So it took like 10 years to move from the initial idea to a final regulation.
Yeah, though we're not finished yet. I mean, the government has agreed to stop issuing new oil and gas exploration permits, largely. There are some existing permits, which are very dangerous. So OMV have got some existing permits off the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. So we're still campaigning to stop the exercise of the existing permits, because were they to find what they're looking for, which is a globally significant new reserve of oil, then that would contribute to the global problem of climate change once it was extracted and burnt.
When you had this idea of the banning, did you have an internal debate, and what were if you had it, what were the opposite ideas regarding banning new oil and gas permits?
I think the issue for anyone who accepts the science around climate change is what are the best tools to get the change that we need, and there are a multitude of them on the demand side as well as the supply side. And it's more a question of tactics as to which group should focus on particular parts of that. And so obviously one part of it is about facilitating the uptake of electric vehicles, for example, which is about destroying demand for oil and transitioning the transport fleet away from fossil fuels. And obviously going alongside that has to be renewable energy generation, because you don't want to be burning coal to generate the electricity for electric vehicles. So there's kind of one side of it. There's the whole question about putting a price on carbon to have economy-wide effects in terms of moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy. But then there's also the supply side. And so Greenpeace's particular part of that puzzle, we've done quite a bit of work on the demand side, but we're one of the few that have the resources really to focus on the supply side and try to campaign against oil companies' attempts to get new supply onto the market. Because obviously you have these lock-in effects. If OMV spends $1 billion to find a very large new oil reserve off the New Zealand coast, they're going to be very determined to bring that oil to market, regardless of what happens with climate change. So even as carbon prices might go up, they've already got they've got an asset that they'll be determined to exploit. So it's very important that they never get to the point where they find it.
Very interesting, the thing that you focus on the tactic, and you explain us a little bit about the tactics. So you are, as a Greenpeace in New Zealand, or maybe the global Greenpeace, you are focusing on the supply. And this is interesting also because it maybe explains a little bit more what you would like to do with this action in New Zealand. What is the symbol of this ban? Because banning new oil and gas permits in New Zealand doesn't solve the problem of climate change, but probably you're indicating the direction where we should go, and you are indicating the fight against the supply. Is that right?
What I'm saying is that you've got to look at climate change. Obviously is a global problem, so you've got to take a global perspective on it. So we have the global majors, or we've had the global oil majors in New Zealand, Petrobras, Anadarko, a whole bunch of others, Equinor or Statoil. And so you've got to take a global perspective on it, and you've got to look at the supply side and the demand side. And so as a global environment campaigning organisation, what Greenpeace does is say, we've got to take action globally on the supply and demand side around fossil fuels. What is the best way that Greenpeace can make a difference? And so we have done and continue to do quite a bit of work on the demand side. But we're one of the few organisations that have the resources to really campaign on the supply side at a global level, because we've done obviously a lot of campaigning on the supply side up in the Arctic and elsewhere as well.
Why do you say that you are one of the few organizations that has the power, the will to affect the supply?
Because of the kind of basically the resources we have in terms of the ships we have available, in terms of the global network that we have, because of the global financial resources that we have. I mean, there's just oil companies are pretty scary to take on. They're very obviously very litigious and are very aggressive and have very deep pockets and have very deep political connections. So for many environment campaigning organisations, it can be very difficult to take on a global oil company. And so Greenpeace, is one of the few organisations that has the resources to do that.
And talking about political connections, you mentioned before that you were part of the New Zealand Parliament. You were elected there for several years. And then after being in the Parliament with the Green Party, you moved to Greenpeace. Any problem with that? Because as you mentioned yourself, Greenpeace doesn't accept any money or help from governments or corporations. How were you welcomed to Greenpeace, coming from a Green Party?
Well, I mean, like you say, Greenpeace is politically independent, so we don't take money from government or business, and we don't say vote for anyone. And so when I moved from Parliament to the NGO sector, I resigned my membership of the Green Party and to stay out of that world. Because it is really important that Greenpeace is politically independent. I mean, it's been an interesting experience. So when I was at Parliament, there was a different government. So there was a right-wing government that was very pro the oil and gas and coal industry. And so they passed special legislation through to protect oil exploration. It was called the Anadarko Amendment because it was done at the bequest of Anadarko to criminalise protest at sea. And so when I then moved to Greenpeace, I was, in fact, the first person, or one of the first people, there were three of us, who were charged under that very amendment that I'd opposed as an MB, because we swam in front of a Schlumberger seismic exploration vessel. So it was kind of interesting too, because that piece of legislation was passed by a single vote in Parliament to criminalise climate protesters, and then to be on the other side of it, to have the state then use that law with its penalties, very large financial, and you could be in prison for a year. To use that law was then used against me for interfering with an oil exploration vessel. So it was interesting to have both perspective from both sides of it.
Yes, and very interesting to have the perspective from both sides. But I was wondering if you feel, or somebody felt in Greenpeace, that there was a conflict of interest for you or somebody like you coming from a party, and even if you are not part of that party anymore, you bring the culture of that party into Greenpeace.
I think I certainly was an issue that was considered at the time. I mean, it was an issue for me as well. And so, on balance, like at the end of the day, if you're trying to fill a role, you have a certain number of people applying. But so obviously, on balance, the board at Greenpeace New Zealand decided that, there were certain risks in employing someone who'd previously been a member of Parliament. Those risks were outweighed by the benefits of what I did bring to the role. And, obviously I've been a climate campaigner and an environmental campaigner for decades, both in parties and outside parties, and in Parliament and outside Parliament. So I guess they weighed those things up.
And Russell, were you more effective to fight this fight being a policymaker or the executive director of Greenpeace?
It's I think that you can make change Yeah, I mean, if you think of society in three parts, for example, one way to think about it anyway, if you think about government, business, and civil society as a kind of three locations, I think that you can be effective in any of those three locations in terms of this great transition that we need to make. The thing about civil society is that you probably have more freedom to kind of push things further than you do perhaps in the other two. But I think any of those three places is a perfectly legitimate place to try to push for change. I mean, we've built our civilization over the last 100 years on fossil fuels, and we need to rapidly transition off them, and that is a change of a scale that is they're very, very, very large. And I think we need people in all three of those places, government, business and civil society, to be pushing very hard to make that change as quickly as possible if we're going to do it.
So in here you have listeners, especially in Texas in here, that they are geologists or earth scientists, researchers and scientists, that they belong probably to the business side of this tripartite world. What would you like to tell them? How can they help if they believe in the same pillars that you believe?
We need to rapidly transition our energy system if we're going to avoid a climate disaster. We've for the last 10, 12,000 years, we've had a relatively stable climate, and we've used that relatively stable climate to build this civilization that we have. Obviously, in the last 100 years, in particular, we've rapidly exploited the stored energy reserves that fossil fuels have provided us to accelerate that civilization. But now, all of us need to use our skills and ability and talents to transition away from that. So wherever we find ourselves, we need to do that. It's, I think, quite problematic for people who are currently and have a kind of a career in the oil industry in particular, but coal as well. How do they fit into this? Because plainly, we have to rapidly end the era of fossil fuels. So I think that this is where, we talk about a just transition. There needs to be a transition for those workers who are currently in those sectors that need to rapidly shrink. We need to have support for them so that they can transition away into other sectors, probably other energy sectors, but it might be elsewhere. Because as a civilization as a whole, we just have to get out of fossil fuels as fast as we can. So we've got to support those who are currently in those sectors.
So do you think that is more effective to, let's say we're talking with fine professionals and bright researchers, that they are in a well-established oil and gas industry, like that has more than a century of experience, a cumulative experience. So would it be more effective for these people to leave the business and go into other business, or to the other two parts of the world, government and civil society, or vice versa, remaining inside into their oil and gas industry to do something from within?
I obviously, can't speak to each individual person's situation, but what I would say at a high level is that the oil industry, if the oil industry is as large and as strong and as profitable in 20 years' time as it is today, then that is a dramatic problem for the human species. We literally do have to shrink the size of the fossil fuel industry quite dramatically. So it's difficult for me to see that there's huge gain to be made by working inside the fossil fuel industry, given that I can't see any way forward that is consistent with a relatively stable climate that involves the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry prospering. It's just incompatible with the laws of physics. So, yeah, I mean, my advice would be to look outside the fossil fuel industry. Now, that's obviously easier said than done, because this is a very large industry that, like you say, has a century of history, and in my family's been involved in it. You know, I've had other brothers who've been involved in it as well. So I totally understand the constraints, but nonetheless, we need to get out of it. And so the people that are currently in it need to be supported by government to help the transition as quickly as possible.
So how do you see those corporations, major corporations, that they are in the oil and gas business, but they are transitioning, and they call themselves now energy companies, and they are looking at electricity. So they're moving to renewables, even if baby steps. What do you think about those?
I think sometimes it can be a bit of window dressing, and so at various times in the past we've seen these kind of announcements. BP, of course, famously, Beyond Petroleum, some years ago. Now that, you know, but obviously that doesn't mean that every company saying that it plans to be an energy company that moves beyond fossil fuels, that every time a company says that, it's not true. I would encourage oil companies to get out of the fossil fuel industry and get into the energy business, the renewable energy business. And there may well be, I would think, some oil companies that can make that transition. However, I also think that there will be a lot of oil companies that end up sitting on stranded assets, and that there will be a very significant destruction in capital value within the fossil fuel industry over the next 20 years as those assets become less valuable because they're incompatible with the future of human civilization. So on the one hand, you know, I want to encourage energy companies to make that transition as quickly as possible. On the other hand, I'm not going to pretend that there won't be a significant loss of value in a lot of the assets that those fossil fuel companies currently own.
Russell, going back to the ban on the new oil and gas permits in New Zealand, when you were working on that, and we understood that it took around 10 years from the idea to the regulation, what were the compromises that you have to take along the road?
I mean, if you think about the decision of the New Zealand government wasn't everything we wanted. So they decided that they would stop issuing new oil and gas exploration permits, with the exception of one onshore region called Taranaki. Whereas what we're seeking is actually the cancellation of the existing permits as well. So that was a compromise that the government reached, whereas our view is that even the existing permits should be cancelled. So that's a kind of a compromise, if you like, but we accept that, you know, it was still a very significant step forward. You know, that's probably the primary kind of compromise we had to make, because we did congratulate the government for making that step forward. But now we're actually, campaigning to stop the existing permits. So OMV in particular, the Austrian oil company, are planning or are talking about looking for new oil off the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. And so we're campaigning for that not to happen, because it would be a tragedy were they to discover masses of new oil there.
Did you learn that the art of compromise when you were in the parliament? Are you bringing it to Greenpeace?
Clearly, there are some things you need to compromise on, but there are also some things you really shouldn't compromise on. And so just the basic laws of physics are inescapable. So when you look at the amount of fossil fuel reserves that we've already discovered, and those we've burnt and those that are still in the ground, there is no compromise with the laws of physics. You can't pretend. I guess you can pretend, but you can't change the reality. I mean, and so the reality is, if we burnt all the fossil fuel reserves that we have already discovered, then we would have catastrophic climate change. And so that leads me to the conclusion that we have to rapidly stop burning fossil fuel reserves, and that can seem to be quite an uncompromising position. But I think that I'm a rationalist, and I've got a science background, and it's plainly they're just the facts of the matter. If we want to avoid rapid and very dangerous climate change, that's what we need to do. And so there's no point compromising around that reality. That's just what it means to understand physical limits.
And did you talk with the oil and gas industry while you were thinking about this ban?
We've talked to them a little bit, but not a huge amount. I mean, we basically, the business model for the oil and gas industry is to make money out of catastrophic climate change. I mean, it's just hard to avoid some hard realities like that. So there's quite a deep contradiction, if you like, between the business model of the oil industry in a stable climate, and hence the advocacy of environment organisations. It's not like this doesn't involve me. My family, were involved in the oil and gas and coal industry, and I kind of get where they're coming from. And I don't think, I don't necessarily get too upset with what people say about, from the oil industry. I kind of understand that's just their reality. But, there are some very deep contradictions between the business model of the oil industry and the physics of living on a finite planet.
So, Russel, do you have a lot of fights internally in your family with your brothers and father working in these other sectors that you are really fighting against?
My father, unfortunately, is dead now, but he before he died some years ago, he was getting his head around the realities of climate science like all of us, and what that meant, which is very challenging at a personal level. But with my brothers, not really. I mean, the gas boom in Australia, because my family's from Australia, the gas boom in Australia has been obviously a significant source of income for many people, including some in my family. But people also understand the limitations of what they're doing, and I'm sure it's the case for many of your listeners, is that they need money. They've got to feed their kids. They've got to pay their mortgages. They want to pay for their kids' education, all of those things. And yet they also know that, the industry that they're working in is destabilising the climate that their children need to live on, to live on this planet. So I think my family also understands those contradictions.
What are the negative consequences of the ban on the oil and gas permits in New Zealand? For instance, I'm just thinking about maybe you in New Zealand now you have to pay more for energy for a little while. I don't know, maybe something like that.
Well, I mean, as you know, the oil market is a global market, so the price of oil in New Zealand is set by the global market. We're oil importers, but even to the extent that we export oil, it wouldn't change the price of oil in New Zealand because it's set by a global price. And then on top of that, obviously, you've got all the local taxes and so forth. So the kind of price of petrol at the pump or gas, as you say in America, at the pump is not really influenced directly or immediately by what's going on with the New Zealand oil and gas exploration ban. One would hope, though, that in the bigger picture, if we are able to constrain new supply globally, that will, combined with a destruction in demand, that will kind of have an effect in terms of the global oil market. In terms of the kind of energy market outside of oil, New Zealand is we have probably about 20 years of gas left in reserve currently. And so that is more than sufficient to kind of power the transition in generation that we need to make in the electricity sector. New Zealand already has pretty high renewables in the electricity sector, over 80%, but there's going to be a big increase in demand as we electrify transport and industrial processes as we move them away from fossil fuels. So we need to make sure there's sufficient new generation from renewable sources, and with 20 years of gas up our sleeve, there's sufficient gas, I'm sure, there to ensure that we can make the transition. So the immediate consequences in terms of the New Zealand energy market are very limited.
But Russell, do you have, as representing Greenpeace, a specific renewable that you prefer to use when the switch occurs?
Well, I mean, we've been basically working with the electricity industry in New Zealand to because the transition, particularly the electrification of transport, is a huge opportunity for the electricity industry. And so we are particularly looking at an increase in solar, wind and batteries, which are the kind of cheapest three next sets of technologies that we need to expand in order to meet that demand out of transport in particular, but also industrial processes. They're obviously going to be the growing, I mean, they are the growing industries in New Zealand but elsewhere. So, we certainly have been promoting wind and solar, but also batteries as a kind of key part of the transition.
And aren't you concerned about the also solar, wind, and especially batteries? They may have some waste, important waste, and they could pollute this kind of waste. Aren't you afraid about that regarding solar, wind, especially batteries?
Yeah, so plainly there needs to be proper, particularly around batteries, because there's going to be a massive increase in dealing with end-of-life batteries. There's a kind of secondary market in batteries, particularly electric vehicle batteries. There's going to be a secondary market for stationary batteries around in houses. But ultimately there's going to be an end-of-life battery waste stream that's going to be quite significant. And globally there really aren't the recycling initiatives in place yet to deal properly with that. And as battery technology expands, that's going to be critical. So absolutely, we need to make sure we deal with all of that.
And going back to talk about politics, that they had a positive role in the success of the renewables, at least in the last 10 years, contributing, for instance, in their growth. However, politics, they may also be a hurdle and an obstacle. So do you think that the economic convenience by itself, driven by new technology, could be enough to produce the switch from the conventional fossil fuel to the renewable energy sources? Isn't it just the economy enough, or we need something else?
I think the economics around solar and wind and batteries are one of the key drivers of change, which has been fantastic as the price of solar and wind and batteries has come down. Though obviously batteries is lagging solar and wind, but in some ways actually has probably more potential going forward from here to actually reduce its pricing. So that's definitely one of the key parts of it. But there's also very significant government support for fossil fuel industries. So So that distorts the market signals coming out of the renewable sector. So, for example, in New Zealand right now, we're looking at OMV proposing to do this very large oil exploration program where all the kind of insurance costs of if there's, say, a Deepwater Horizon style spill in New Zealand, which costs BP in the order of $62 billion or something like that, that cost would, under current law in New Zealand, those costs would be picked up largely by the New Zealand taxpayer rather than OMV. And oil companies have made it pretty clear that if they had to pay insurance to cover the full costs of the risks of exploration and the oil spills, then they wouldn't proceed with their exploration. So that's a very large and expensive subsidy from the taxpayer or the government to oil industries. So if it was just left up to markets, then I think oil industries would be dead. Oil companies would be pretty much dead in the water. But they only survive because they have such very large subsidies from governments. So I'm very much of the view that if we put a price on carbon to reflect its true cost to society, and if we remove the subsidies from the oil, gas and coal industry, then renewables would pretty quickly do over the old fossil fuel industries. But currently governments are propping up fossil fuels.
But governments, they are led by people that they are elected by the people. So if the people, they decide, they can change the governments, and the governments, they can change the regulations.
Yeah, so then you obviously enter the world of, obviously you're speaking in a US context and you'll be very familiar with it, of the influence of money on politics. And so, the influence of very large oil companies and individuals in terms of lobbying politics, and we're seeing that obviously particularly acutely with the Trump administration in the United States at the moment. But it's obviously a much bigger problem. Oil companies and fossil fuel companies spend very, very large sums on their lobbying efforts in Washington, but also in terms of their donations to political parties and so forth and so on. So yes, it's certainly in an ideal world, democracy would function to remove those subsidies to fossil fuel companies, but fossil fuel companies have tremendous ability to influence the political process.
How important are the United States policies for the world, from your point of view that you are in an organization that is global?
They're very important. So if you think about climate change from a big picture, it's such a difficult problem for human beings to grapple with. It will evolve. The evolution to where we are today. Our brains are not really very well set up to deal with problems that are intergenerational and global. So basically we have to, our collective intelligence, we have to kind of understand that this is a problem which has intergenerational implications. So our actions today will have their worst effect, in fact, on probably our grandchildren, even though we're already starting to see the effects of climate change. It's a long-term problem, but also it's a global problem. So we need everybody around the world, or most everybody, most governments, to, if you like, hold hands and act together. And human beings have a very poor history of being able to act together for a global collective purpose, particularly an intergenerational global collective purpose. So the fact that the United States is led by essentially a science denier, a climate science denier, does create a lot of problems for our efforts to have globally coordinated action on climate change.
What is easier? Is easier to change people's behavior, like just trying to persuade them to leave the standard car and move into electric car, or is easier to influence the choice of a government, for instance, doing a ban on the oil and gas permits? I
mean, the answer, well, my answer would be, I I don't know which is easier. I just think we need to do both, and they influence each other. So as citizens become more attuned to environmental issues, they start to change some of their behaviours, but they also start to change governments. And then as they change governments change the rules or the structures. So when governments make decisions to stop subsidising oil companies, then then obviously that makes it harder for oil companies. When governments make decisions to support public transport or making cities safer to cycle in, then that influences the individual decisions of people as consumers of transport services, because they might go, well, I could ride the bike, I don't have to drive the car, or I could take the bus or the train, So we need to operate both, trying to change people's individual behaviour, but also change the structures, which is, of course, what government and business has a big part in setting.
And what is, Russell, Greenpeace tactic? It is more influencing people or the government?
It's the kind of power resources that we have, if you like, they emanate from people. So we're a people-powered organisation, to use the slogan, but I think it's an accurate one. I mean, it's ordinary people that fund us. It's ordinary people that come out to campaign with us, that we have influence. But of course, that people power then has the ability to influence government and business, and it influences government via elections and democracy and so forth, and it influences business by consumer behaviour and consumer choices. So the people power is at the heart of how we can make change, but it has these secondary effects in terms of influencing business through consumer and markets, and influencing governments through elections and citizens.
Russell, Greenpeace is known for its direct and very emphatic to bring to public attention about specific environmental issues. And we also mentioned at the very beginning that there are about 3 million people that they support the organization with donations. But if you look inside Greenpeace, from the height of your position, what is Greenpeace missing in order to grow more and more quickly?
Daniel, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. We're trying to have as much influence as we can on the climate debate, and to just to push this transition as fast as we can. And obviously, the more people that support us, the better. We're doing everything we can, but I don't really know the answer to that.
Russell, is maybe any internal problem in Greenpeace, or what are the debates internally that you have? Are you looking at different directions?
We as an organisation have made some global decisions in terms of a focus on climate change and biodiversity, and that's which we published in a global framework document we produced a few years ago, and that really provides the direction, I guess, for what we're trying to achieve. That's kind of our orientation.
I see. Russell, I'm going to leave you the mic open. You have an open mic in here. We are at Mini Geology radio show. We have with us Russel Norman, the Executive Director of Greenpeace New Zealand. And Russell, you can talk a couple of minutes if you have something else that you want to add, something different or something new, or if you want to pitch to somebody, if you want to send a message to students, professional earth scientists, or the United States where we are based, whatever. You have an open mic.
Thanks, Daniel. Look, this is a moment in history that we've got to decide what it is that we as a species want to do. We're facing a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. Look around you. What is the earth that you want your kids to inherit? So we've all got to do what we can, and I'm not going to tell anyone exactly what they should be doing, but looking at the skills and opportunities and privileges each of us has as people, how are we going to contribute to saving a relatively stable climate and saving and restoring the last of the amazing biodiversity that really is on this amazing planet of ours. And so I guess all of us have got to look into our hearts and look into our children's eyes and decide how we're going to contribute to that. And I hope that collectively we make the right decisions.
Russel, thank you so much. It has been a great pleasure to have you virtually with us, even in the other hemisphere, but still on this planet. And we really thank you. If you have anything else in the near future, you can always count on us and use the KPFT and Mini Geology as a megaphone. Thanks again, Russel. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Daniel, for having me on the show.